If you grew up on a farm anywhere on the Canadian prairies, you grew up knowing Morris, the red and black iron in the yard, the name stamped on the rod weeder your grandfather pulled behind a horse, the air drill your father trusted to put a crop in the ground. At its peak, Morris Industries shipped specialized farm equipment from 3 plants and 260 dealers to farmers on 3 continents. They survived the Dust Bowl, survived the Depression, survived the Second World War, the 1980s farm crisis, and 40 years of consolidation by the American giants. And then, on the 8th of January, 2020, the 91-year-old company filed for protection from its creditors. How does the iron that taught the prairies how to keep their soil end up in a Saskatoon courtroom on a winter morning? What went wrong? Chapter 1. The Man on the Horse. The story begins on a farm at Llewellyn, in what was still, in 1904, the Northwest Territories, the year before the railway and the politicians between them carved the district into a province called Saskatchewan. George Morris was born on the 1st of July that year. His father broke the land. George helped, the way Prairie sons did, from the moment he was old enough to hold a line of horses straight down a furrow. He farmed with his father until he was 20. 20 was old enough to know 2 things. The first was that he loved the land. The second was that he had no intention of spending the rest of his life behind a team of horses. So in 1924, he did something his neighbors found peculiar. He took a course in motor mechanics. And then he opened a garage. Bangor, Saskatchewan, in 1924, was not the sort of place where a young man opened a garage and expected to get rich. It was a railway siding and a grain elevator and a handful of houses on a treeless stretch of prairie east of Yorkton, in country that lay within Treaty 4 territory and the homeland of the Métis. The roads were dirt when they were anything at all. The cars were few, but the threshing machines were many, and the binders were many, and the steam engines, and the gas tractors, and the cream separators, and the seed drills were many, and all of them broke. Morris Garage opened its doors to fix them. He was 20 years old, with a course in motor mechanics behind him and a wrench in his hand, and he was about to invent something that would feed half the dry world. What George Morris noticed, from inside the grease pit of his small-town garage, was that the machines he was being asked to repair were not the machines the prairies actually needed. The summer fallow system that prairie farmers use to conserve moisture, leave the field idle every other year, work it shallow, let it gather rain, was killing the soil. The cultivators of the day chopped the topsoil into a fine, dry mulch. The wind did the rest. By the early 1930s, 13 million acres of prairie summer fallow lay open to the sky every year, and the fine, silty soil of the Palliser Triangle was lifting off it in clouds that darkened the sun. There was a tool that could have helped. The rod weeder, a horizontal steel rod dragged just beneath the surface, severing weed roots without disturbing the trash cover above. The trouble was that the prairies were full of stones. Frost heave pushed a new crop of them to the surface every spring. When the rod hit a stone, it bent or snapped, and the farmer was on his knees in the dirt swearing at a broken piece of imported iron. Morris worked on the problem in the garage at Bangor between repair jobs, through the long evenings when the cars stopped coming in. He worked on it the way a mechanic works on a problem, by taking it apart and putting it back together a different way, and then a different way again. And in 1929, in a building that his lifelong friend Norman Roebuck would later describe to the Western Development Museum as having been operated under very primitive conditions, he found it. The trick was a spring strong enough to hold the rod down in the dirt against the friction of the soil, but weak enough that when the rod struck a buried stone, it would yield, lift the rod up and over the obstacle, hold it clear for half a second, then snap it back down to its working depth on the other side. An automatic trip, the world's first. The rod would stop breaking. The summer fallow would stop blowing away. And a Saskatchewan boy in a garage at Bangor, with no engineering degree and a head full of grease, had figured out how. In the spring of 1930, a farmer named Luke Battersby of Goodeve, Saskatchewan, wrote to him. He'd heard about the machine. He wanted one. Morris built it. 8 feet wide, horse-drawn, hand-painted, Every weld and bolt and bend done by Morris himself in the garage at Bangor. The price was $148. Battersby paid. Battersby used the same machine for 21 years. And one day in 1930 or thereabouts, according to Norman Roebuck, who told the story to the museum many years later, George Morris arrived at a neighbor's farm on horseback to sell a rod weeder. He'd ridden over from Bangor. He had brochures. He had figures. He had, on the back of an animal that was about to become obsolete on the western prairies, a sales pitch for the machine that would help make it so. It is one of the cleaner pictures in Canadian industrial history. A young man on a horse, riding through the dust, selling the machine that would replace the horse, selling it, no less, to the people who would no longer need to keep one. Chapter 2. A Spring in the Steel. The Dirty 30s came down on Saskatchewan the year after George Morris sold Luke Battersby his first weeder. They came down on a province that had bet everything on wheat and on a soil that, when the rain stopped, turned out to be lighter than anyone had imagined. The Palliser Triangle, the dry belt that runs from southwestern Manitoba across southern Saskatchewan into southeastern Alberta, emptied itself into the sky. There are photographs of farmsteads with the dust drifted up to the eaves of the barns, the way snow drifts in any other winter. Farms went under. Families left. The Saskatchewan Wheat Pool, which had signed up 45,000 farmers in a single year in the 1920s, watched its members walk off the land. And George Morris's order book began to fill. The rod weeder did what nothing else could do. Dr. Ron Ford, who would later teach agricultural engineering at the University of Saskatchewan, put it plainly: good weed control with minimum disturbance of the trash cover. That was the magic phrase. Trash cover, the stubble and chaff left from last year's crop, held the moisture in and held the topsoil down. Conventional cultivators destroyed it. The rod weeder slid underneath it, severed the weed roots, and left the crop residue lying on the surface where the wind had to work harder to take it. In a province where the wind was taking everything else, this was salvation made out of half-inch steel. He patented the trip mechanism in 1929. He patented a redesigned rod weeder in April of 1932. Over the course of his working life, George Morris would hold 15 Canadian patents, including, somewhere along the line, a rotary snowblower and a left-hand swather. The second one designed because his wife liked to drive the swather and preferred the controls reversed. He kept inventing. He kept building. He kept selling. By 1935, the garage at Bangor was no longer big enough. The Morris Rod Weeder Company moved to Prairie, Manitoba, where it could draw on a deeper pool of mechanics and a better rail connection. The Second World War came and went. Morris stayed small through it. Too small to be retooled for munitions, too far west for the big federal contracts. But the demand for tillage equipment held, and when the war ended and the returning soldiers went onto the land under the Veterans Land Act, Morris was ready for them. In 1949, the company moved again, this time to a long, low building on York Road on the southern edge of Yorkton, Saskatchewan, back across the provincial line, back home, into a town of 7,000 people in the Parkland Belt north of Regina. The Morris Rod Weeder and Equipment Company officially opened its Yorkton plant in June of 1949. And then, in the words of the local historical record, every year for the next 18 years there was more expansions. That sentence, in its plainness, is the rise of Morris Industries in miniature. Every year for the next 18 years there were more expansions, more bays, more welders, more steel, more machines going out the doors and down the rail spur, and onto flat cars bound for elevators and dealerships across the Prairie West. Chapter 3. From Bangor to the Prairie. By 1960, the company had outgrown Yorkton as well. A second manufacturing plant opened that year in Minnedosa, Manitoba, on the line between Brandon and Riding Mountain, in a town whose name comes from the Sioux word for rushing water. Manufacturing began on the 19th of September, 1960. 6 years later, on the 20th of October, 1966, George Morris cut the ribbon on a brand new $1-million-plus plant on the edge of town. $1-million plants were not common in Manitoba towns of 3,000 people in 1966. Morris was building one anyway. He was also building a product line that had outgrown the rod weeder. In 1960, the company introduced the seed-right hoe drill, a combination machine that pulled a cultivator, a seed drill, and a rod weeder behind a single tractor, doing in one pass what had taken 3. Then came the multiplex in 1969. Then the Challenger light cultivator in 1970. Then the Magnum chisel plow in 1979. The Magnum II in 1984. In 1981, in the kind of move that signals a company sure of its place in the industry, Morris bought the patents and rights to the Melrow moldboard plow from south of the border and put it into production at Yorkton in 1982. And then there was Australia. Around 1970, an Australian farm equipment dealer made the trip across the Pacific to Yorkton. The story, as Morris's own company history tells it, is that the Australians approached Morris because they were facing the same problem the Canadian prairies had faced 40 years earlier. Too much plowing, too little rain, soil blowing off paddocks the size of European countries. They wanted the machine that had stopped the same thing from happening on the Canadian prairies. Morris said yes. Morris Industries became the first Canadian implement company ever to do business in Australia. It would not be the last business they did there. By the end of the decade, Morris Equipment was working paddocks in Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, and New South Wales. 2 rod weeders went into India in 1975. Morris tillage equipment, by the company's own records, was dropped onto Algerian soil on the 17th of December, 1974. A Saskatchewan boy who'd left Bangor on a horse was now selling machines on 3 continents. The American expansion came at the same time. A sales and welding operation opened in Minot, North Dakota, on the 2nd of February, 1972, and ran for years. Another facility opened at Ortonville, Minnesota, in 1976 and closed in 1984. Both serviced the American wheat belt directly out of the same country that the Canadian plants were serving, short hauls south across the Medicine Line, into Montana and the Dakotas, where the soil and the weather and the problems were essentially identical to Saskatchewan's. George Morris died in 1989. He was 85 years old. He had received the Order of Canada in 1980 and the Saskatchewan Order of Merit in 1988. The name of the company he had founded 60 years earlier in a garage at Bangor had been changed the year before his death, from Morris Rod Weeder to Morris Industries, a recognition that the rod weeder, while still in the catalog, was now one product among many. His daughter Wendy Morris took over as chief executive in 1991. In 1997, she bought out the rest of the family and became sole owner of a company that, by then, employed hundreds of welders and machinists and assemblers across 3 plants in 2 provinces and 1 American state, and shipped its iron to farmers on 3 continents. Parks Canada had, by then, designated the invention of the Morris Rod Weeder a national historic event. The very machine that George Morris had bought back from his first customer in 1951, the original Battersby Weeder, the one with 21 years of Saskatchewan dirt ground into its bones, was on permanent display at the Western Development Museum in Yorkton, catalogued as Artifact WDM 1973 Y2834. A garage in Bangor, a horse, a spring of steel, and on the wall of a museum, a piece of iron that had become a piece of provincial scripture. Chapter 4. Red Iron, Cold Steel. To stand in the Yorkton plant in January, in the middle of a good run, was to stand inside 2 weathers at once. Outside, the Prairie was doing what the Prairie does in January. The temperature on the gauge by the parking lot read -34, with a wind out of the northwest that pulled it down toward -45 on the wind chill scale. The snow was packed and squeaky underfoot. Pickup trucks idled in long rows, their exhausts white-plumed, their drivers having learned the Prairie habit of leaving the engine running at lunch because a cold-soaked diesel could refuse to start at -30 and strand a man until the tow truck came. The plant itself sat on the south side of York Road in a low, long shape under a corrugated roof, its tall windows lit yellow against the dark, its vent stacks pushing steam straight up into a sky too cold to let it spread. Inside, the welding bay was running hot enough to need open doors. Big, rolling doors, 8 feet wide, swung partway up to let the heat off the welds escape into the colder air of the assembly floor. And the cold of the assembly floor was the floor's idea of warm, because the assembly floor was 45 degrees Fahrenheit, and the welding bay, with 36 MIG and TIG arcs striking at once, was somewhere over 100. A welder in the bay wore a t-shirt under his leathers. A welder walking from the bay to the lunchroom put on a jacket. A welder walking from the lunchroom to his truck at 5:30 put on a jacket, a parka, a toque, mitts, and boots rated to -50, and he still drove home with the heater on full. The line moved from the cutting tables at the west end of the building toward the paint booth at the east. At the west end, plasma cutters traced the silhouettes of frame members out of half-inch and quarter-inch sheet, drawing patterns out of steel the way a tailor draws patterns out of cloth. And the air at that end of the floor smelled of cutting oil and ozone, and that particular acrid sharpness that plasma leaves when it eats through plate. The cut pieces moved on rollers down to the press brakes, where hydraulic rams bent them into shapes, frame uprights, opener brackets, hitch tongues, and from the brakes to the welding fixtures, where jigs the size of pickup trucks held the parts in place while the welders ran their beads. The smell shifted as you walked east. Cutting oil gave way to flux and weld fume. Weld fume gave way to grinding dust, then to the chemical bite of zinc primer, then, finally, to the wet, organic, almost sweet smell of the top coat in the paint booth. Morris red over a coat of Morris black. The company colors. The colors a prairie farmer could see from half a mile down a township road, and know without thinking what brand of iron was coming. Howard Jones worked somewhere along that line. In 2011, he was named WorkSafe Saskatchewan's Safe Worker of the Year, an award given by the Provincial Workers' Compensation Board to recognize individuals who had built a record of safety in industries where safety did not come easily. The Morris floors were full of pinch points and fall hazards and arc flash and overhead crane loads, and the company, that same year, won the inaugural Made Safe Safety Excellence in Manufacturing Award in Manitoba. Howard Jones's name went up on a plaque in the Yorkton break room. A small ceremony. A handshake from the plant manager. Then back to the floor. In 2019, the year before everything came apart, Morris held a service awards night. A worker in the Yorkton plant was honored for 45 years of service, another for 40, a third for 35, a fourth for 25. 45 years meant a man had walked into that building for the first time in 1974, a year after the company's expansion into Australia, when George Morris was still alive and Wendy Morris was a teenager, and had walked out for the last time only when the lights went off in 2020. 25 years was a career. 45 years was a life. Out beyond the plant, the company had built itself into something its founder would have recognized, but its first neighbors in Bangor could not have imagined. More than 300,000 square feet of manufacturing across 3 plants. 260 independent dealers and distributors in Canada, the United States, and Australia. Product shipping in any given year to China, France, Germany, Jordan, New Zealand, Saudi Arabia, Tanzania, Ukraine, to any place on earth where someone was trying to grow grain in soil that did not want to hold itself in place. The Encyclopedia of Saskatchewan, in its entry on the company, called Morris one of the largest manufacturers of specialized farm equipment in Western Canada. The workforce that built it was Yorkton's workforce, and Yorkton's workforce was a particular thing. The east-central Saskatchewan parkland had been settled, more than anywhere else in the province, by Ukrainians, by families who'd come out under the Sifton immigration program in the 1890s and 1900s, by the wave after the First World War, and by the displaced persons wave after the Second. By the 1980s, half the welders on the Morris floor had a baba who spoke Ukrainian at home, and a grandfather buried under a 3-bar cross at one of the Orthodox cemeteries out of town. There were Polish names on the time clock as well, and German names from the Lutheran villages south of the city, and Scottish and English names that went back to the original Hudson's Bay and railway settlements. A few Cree and Saulteaux names from the reserves at Yellowquill and Cote and Key. The accents on the floor at lunch were a slice of the prairie itself, flat, dry, undramatic, with the particular round vowels of east-central Saskatchewan, and the occasional Ukrainian word slipping in for tools that English didn't have a good name for. They built rod weeders. They built seed rights. They built magnums and multiplexes and challengers. And then, in 1989, they started building a new kind of machine entirely, a machine that fit the new way the prairies were learning to farm. Chapter 5. The Air-Seeding Decades. The Canadian prairies in the late 1980s were in the middle of a quiet revolution. Conventional tillage, the plowing and dissing routine that had been standard since George Morris was a boy, was being abandoned in favor of something farmers called minimum till or zero till. The new way left the stubble on the field over winter, planted directly into it in the spring, and disturbed the soil as little as possible. It was the rod weeder principle applied to the entire system. It saved fuel, it saved time, it saved moisture, and it required a new kind of seeder. The new kind of seeder was the air drill. A long bar of openers, sometimes 20 feet wide, sometimes 40, eventually 100, pulled behind a tractor, fed by an air cart that hissed and clattered along behind, blowing seed and fertilizer down a network of plastic tubes to be placed precisely in the ground. It was a machine that looked, when it was working, like a piece of industrial weather. A wall of dust trailing behind a tractor, with 80 or 90 furrows opening at once, and a tail of seed-bearing air going down to meet them. The first tow-behind air seeder cart in the world had been built not by Morris, but by Bourgault, a competitor across the province in St. Brieuc, Saskatchewan, founded by a farmer named Frank Bourgault in 1974. Bourgault released the world's first 138-bushel tow-behind air cart in 1980. Morris was not the originator of the air cart. Morris was the fast follower. But the fast follower can be a formidable thing. The 6000 series air cart came off Morris's lines in 1989, the Maxim air drill in 1992, the 7000 series precision air cart in 1994, the Maxim 2 in 1999, the Contour air drill in 2007, the C2 Contour in 2011, the 9 series air cart with input control technology, variable rate metering, sectional shutoff, the Prairie's answer to precision agriculture, in 2013. Through the 1990s and into the 2010s, Morris built one of the most respected air seeding lineups in the world, and the company's red iron became as common a sight on a prairie spring morning as a flock of Canada geese rising off a slough. The University of Saskatchewan worked with them. The College of Agriculture and Bioresources had a long, productive relationship with Morris, a relationship that, in 2016, became a $450,000 zero-cost equipment lease with Morris machines on the university's research farms outside Saskatoon and Saskatchewan agronomy graduates going into Morris's engineering department as a matter of routine. The company sponsored amateur hockey, including, at one point, a Canada-Kazakhstan exchange that took Prairie kids to Almaty and brought Kazakh kids to Saskatchewan. It was the kind of corporate citizenship that does not look like marketing because it is too small and too local to bother marketing. It was simply what a Prairie family company did when it had made enough money to do it. The 260 dealers, the heart of the operation, were independents. That word carried a particular weight in the Prairie ag equipment world. An independent dealer was a family-owned business in a town of 2,000 people, selling Morris equipment alongside maybe a versatile tractor line, or a Heston haying line, or a New Holland combine line, depending on what the family had picked up over the generations. The dealer principal knew his customers by their first names, by their father's first names, and by the names of the quarter sections they farmed. He knew which customer was good for a long term and which one would pay cash. He knew which Morris drill was working in which field, and when it had last gone in for service because he'd serviced it himself or watched his service manager do it. Morris was sold by people who knew the buyers. That was its moat. And then came August of 2012. On the 1st of that month, the Canadian Wheat Board lost its monopoly on Western Canadian wheat and barley sales. 64 years of single-desk marketing came to an end. The political fight over that change had run for years. What mattered, for the equipment industry, was the consequence. With the Wheat Board gone, prairie grain farming consolidated faster than ever. Small farms sold to bigger ones. Bigger ones bought out their neighbors. The average farm size in Saskatchewan, which had been rising steadily for decades, accelerated through the 2010s. And the machines those farms wanted to buy got bigger. A 60-foot air drill became a normal piece of equipment. A 700-bushel air cart became a normal piece of equipment. 8,000-acre farms became normal. The Morris customer was changing. He had 3 combines now, not 1. He hired seasonal help. He talked to his banker more often than he talked to his agronomist. He could afford, when the time came, to spend $600,000 on a single seeding rig. And he expected, in return, a rig that would put a crop in the ground across his entire farm in 5 days flat. Morris was selling into that boom. The Minnedosa plant expanded in 2006 and again in 2014. The 9 Series air cart came out in 2013. The Pro AG hay equipment line, acquired in 2002, was running steadily. The order books were full. The dealers were happy. And in head office, the conversation was about what would come next. What came next would change the company's ownership for the 2nd time in its history, and the 3rd time in the lives of its longest-serving workers. In June of 2007, Wendy Morris had already done what George Morris had never imagined doing. She'd sold the family company. The buyer was Casey Davis, who had been the company's president and CEO since 2001, along with a group of minority shareholders. Davis was not a Morris, but he had been running the company for 6 years, and he knew the operation, and Wendy was ready to step back. The 78-year-old family business was no longer a family business. Davis kept the head office in Saskatoon. The Morris head office had moved from Yorkton to Saskatoon by then, to a building on Airport Drive in the city's industrial north end, closer to the University of Saskatchewan, closer to the airline routes, closer to where the engineers and the marketing people wanted to live. The plants stayed where they were. The dealers stayed where they were. From the outside, nothing changed. From the inside, the company had begun to feel different. The Morris family was still on the masthead in name, but the Morris family was not in the building. Chapter 6. The Promise of New Iron. In September of 2017, a new ownership group took control of Morris Industries. It was led by a man named Ben Voss. Voss was a Saskatchewan-trained executive with a strong agricultural background and the backing of 2 investment groups, Avrio Capital out of Calgary and the Lamont Brown Group. The deal made Voss the majority owner. Casey Davis kept a minority share and a seat on the board. The transition was treated in the trade press as the next chapter of a long, healthy story. Voss said the right things on the day the deal closed. I am truly honored and excited today to be part of the next chapter of what is a historic and iconic company, he told the Western producer. I want to continue that tradition and build on that great legacy. The plan, as he laid it out, was to put even more investment into research and development, more investment into our factories, and coming out with lots of new products. The federal government agreed. That same year, Morris received $4 million in federal funding to modernize its plants. In June of 2018, at the Canada's Farm Progress Show in Regina, and again at Ag in Motion, outside Saskatoon a few weeks later, Morris unveiled what it called the Quantum Air Drill, a new opener system, a new frame design, advertised in the company's own literature as 154% stronger than any previous Morris drill. New hydraulics, new down pressure control, the first wholly new air drill the company had launched in years, and the first under the new ownership. It was, in every visible way, a triumph. In August of 2018, at the Dower Field Days in Western Australia, the biggest farm equipment show in the Southern Hemisphere, the Quantum won Best New Release. The Prairie press carried the story. Australian farmers placed orders. North American dealers placed orders. The Quantum went into full production at Yorkton and Minnedosa through the second half of 2018, building toward what was expected to be the company's biggest seeding season delivery in its history. There was, that summer, a particular feeling around Morris. The kind of feeling a company gets when it has bet hard, and the bet seems to be paying off. The investment had gone in. The product was out. The reviews were good. The orders were strong. The longest-serving workers on the Yorkton floor, the ones with 25 and 35 and 40 years of service, walked into the plant in the morning with a sense that the old company had found its second wind. Standing at the top of that summer, nobody at Morris could see what was about to come at them from Australia, from China, from Washington, and from a hydraulic spike in a system that nobody had thought to test in the conditions where it would matter most. The strongest drill the company had ever built was, at that moment, rolling onto rail cars bound for paddocks where the soil was harder and drier than anything a Saskatchewan engineer had designed for. These floors would one day fall silent, but not yet. In the summer of 2018, the line was running 3 shifts. The yard was full of red iron in primer waiting for paint. The dealer phones were ringing, and in head office on Airport Drive in Saskatoon, the new owners were planning the company's next decade. Chapter 7. The Neighbor, Across the Province. The other Prairie family that built air drills was 3 hours' drive northwest of Yorkton, in a town of 600 people called St. Brieuc. Frank Bourgault had started his company there in 1974. By 1980, he'd built the world's first tow-behind 138-bushel air-seeder cart. By the 2010s, his sons Jerry and Marcel were running Bourgault Industries, and Bourgault Industries was the air-seeding leader in Canada, and one of the leaders in the world. Same province, same farmers, same dealers, in many cases. A different trajectory. Bourgault's plant at St. Brieuc had grown into one of the largest single-site manufacturing operations in rural Saskatchewan. Bourgault drills went into Australia, into Eastern Europe, into Kazakhstan, into the American grain belt. The Bourgault name, on a prairie farm in 2018, carried roughly the cachet that the Morris name had carried in 1968. The gold standard, the iron the neighbor bought when he'd had a good year and wanted to show it. The contrast was not hostile. It was simply a fact. 2 Saskatchewan families, 2 trajectories, both started in the same generation, both selling into the same fields. One had become the air-seeding leader. The other was trying to catch up. The big 3 were the other shadow. John Deere, out of Moline, Illinois. C&H Industrial, with the Case IH and New Holland brands, out of Burlington, Iowa, and beyond. AGCO, with Massey Ferguson and Fendt, out of Duluth, Georgia. Through the 2000s and 2010s, these companies had been consolidating their dealer networks across the prairies, buying up the multi-line family dealers, merging them into regional super dealers, and quietly pressuring those super dealers to sell green iron, or red iron, or whatever the parent brand was, and to think hard before signing a service agreement on a short line maker like Morris. The short line makers, Morris, Bourgault, Salford, Schulte, Highline, depended on the remaining independents. Every Deere dealer that disappeared into a super dealer was a Morris dealer that disappeared with it. The map of independent farm equipment dealers across Western Canada in 2018 looked thinner than it had in 2008, and the 2008 map had looked thinner than 1998. Then came the macro shocks. In the summer of 2018, the Trump administration in Washington imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. Canada retaliated. Steel prices for Canadian manufacturers spiked. Morris's input costs went up in a year the company had committed to a major new product launch. The next year, in March of 2019, the People's Republic of China suspended its imports of Canadian canola seed in response to the Meng Wanzhou affair. The Prairie canola market, the most lucrative single crop in the Morris customer base, lost its largest buyer overnight. Farmers across Saskatchewan and Alberta delayed equipment purchases. Some canceled orders. Successive crop years had brought their own troubles. Wet falls in 2016 and 2018 had left crops in the field over winter, costing farmers cash flow they would otherwise have spent on iron. Dry springs in Australia had stressed the same dealer base on the other side of the world that Morris was counting on for its quantum launch revenue. The order books, briefly so full, began to thin. The Yorkton plant, which had been running 3 shifts in 2018, dropped to 2 by the middle of 2019, then to 1. And in the warehouses and yards at Yorkton and Minnedosa, on pallets stamped with the names of Australian distributors, sat the parts that would, within a year, decide everything. Chapter 8. The strongest drill we ever built. The Quantum was the strongest drill Morris had ever built. That had been the claim, and on paper it was true. A frame 154% stronger than the previous generation. A heavier hitch. A redesigned opener that combined down pressure with depth control and seed delivery in a single integrated unit. The opener was the heart of it. On any air drill, the opener, the assembly that cuts the slot, places the seed, places the fertilizer, and closes the slot behind it, is the single most expensive component. Drill openers, the company's chief operating officer Kevin Adair would later tell Gray News, make up about 40% of the air drill's unit cost. 40%. On a $600,000 machine, $240,000 of the price tag was riding on the opener system alone. The Quantum opener was a welded and fabricated assembly. It had been designed in Yorkton, tested in Yorkton and on Saskatchewan farms, and validated for North American conditions. By the company's own count, only 5 Quantum drills had run in North America before the 2019 rollout. In Australia, only 2 had run in 2018, both as demonstration units. Then, in the Southern Hemisphere, autumn of 2019, March, April, May, the Quantum drills that had been shipped to Western Australia went into the paddock. Cameron McIntosh ran McIntosh Distribution, the Western Australian arm of the Morris dealer network. He would later put what happened on the record in an interview with Farm Weekly. There was an unforeseen issue with the hydraulic system, he said, where certain circumstances allowed pressure to spike up to 1800 psi above operating pressure. 1800 psi above operating pressure, in a hydraulic circuit designed for a fraction of that. The pressure spikes drove forces through the opener assemblies that the welded fabrication could not absorb. The openers, those 40% of cost openers, those $240,000 a machine assemblies, began to fail in the field. Not in laboratory tests, not on demo plots. In the field, in the middle of seeding, on Australian farms that had paid full price and that were now in possession of broken iron in the middle of the only window of the year that mattered. In North America, where the conditions were less punishing, an upgrade program would suffice. A retrofit kit. A field service call. In Western Australia, where the soil was harder and drier and the seeding window longer and hotter, and the warranty expectations no less than they were on the prairies, the design failed completely. Every Quantum opener in the country needed to be replaced. Not repaired, replaced, with a redesigned cast component opener. McIntosh gave the number. More than 4,500 openers across the country would be updated. 4,500 openers, at 40% of the cost of a machine each, was a number that did something terrible to the Morris balance sheet. The warranty bill, the cost of the replacement components, the freight to Australia, the field labor to do the swap, the goodwill payments to farmers whose seeding seasons had been disrupted, called for, in Kevin Adair's careful words, a significant capital investment far beyond any foreseeable estimates. The other half of the equation was the cash flow. The Australian shipments had gone out in 2018 and early 2019 without the kind of receivables factoring or trade finance arrangement that would normally have brought the company its money on shipment. The cash was, in industry parlance, on the water, or worse, in the paddock, in machines that no longer worked the way they were supposed to. Australian customers, looking at the failed openers, withheld payment until the fixes were made. By the summer of 2019, Morris was owed something like $10 million on iron that had already been shipped, against bills that had to be paid in Yorkton and Minnedosa in Canadian dollars on the 1st of every month. Through the late summer and into the fall of 2019, the company began to make the kinds of decisions a company makes when its cash is gone and its product is broken. The Virden, Manitoba, Sales and Service Center closed. Periodic shutdowns hit the Yorkton and Minnedosa plants. A week off here, 2 weeks off there. The assembly line standing still while the office tried to figure out where the next month's payroll would come from. Wage cuts hit the floor. Assemblers who had been making Prairie industrial wages took a percentage off the top to keep the doors open. Layoffs began at Yorkton, small at first, then larger. By the end of the year, the count was approaching 50 workers off the floor. The COO, Kevin Adair, would later tell the trade press that the failure was the convergence of three forces: the quantum warranty problem, China's canola ban, and the inclement weather conditions in successive crop years. All three were true, but the quantum was the one Morris had built itself. Court documents, filed at the Court of Queen's Bench for Saskatchewan a few months later, would describe what had happened in a more pointed way. They would speak of an ambitious and expensive growth strategy launched by the post-2017 management group. They would note that the quantum had gone into full production with only 7 machines having run in the field, 5 in North America, 2 in Australia, before the 2019 rollout. Among Prairie dealers and Australian farmers on online forums, the verdict was less measured. "I don't believe the quantum drill was ever really field tested much before it left the drawing board," one wrote. "They went straight into production." It was anecdote, not evidence. But the anecdote and the court documents pointed in the same direction. Ben Voss had said, in September of 2017, that he wanted to come out with lots of new products. By the autumn of 2019, the Morris Group did not have enough cash to make payroll. Chapter 9, January 8th. On the 8th of January 2020, the Morris Group filed for protection from its creditors. The filing was made under the Companies' Creditors Arrangement Act. It was made before Justice R.S. Smith of the Court of Queen's Bench for Saskatchewan, sitting at the Judicial Center of Saskatoon. The companies named were 10-109-8672 Saskatchewan Limited, Morris Industries Limited, Morris Sales and Service Limited, Contour Realty Inc., and Morris Industries, USA Inc. The Bank of Montreal, the company's principal lender, agreed to provide interim financing, debtor-in-possession money, to keep the company operating while the court process unfolded. Alvarez and Marsal Canada Inc., the restructuring firm, was appointed monitor. Their representative was Orest Konowalchuk, working out of Calgary. The numbers, when they came out, told a story. Total debts of approximately $53 million. The Bank of Montreal secured for roughly $25 to $26 million of that, plus $6.5 million in court-approved interim financing. Another $10 million owed to other lenders. $4.5 million in missed or secured obligations. $12.5 million owed to unsecured suppliers, the small machine shops and steel suppliers, and freight carriers, and component makers across the prairies and into the American Midwest who had shipped to Morris on 30 and 60-day terms and were now standing in line behind the bank. The fiscal year that had ended on the 31st of August 2019 told its own story. Assets of $65.9 million. Liabilities of $63.3 million. Of the assets, $34.2 million was inventory. Iron sitting in yards at Yorkton and Minnedosa, waiting for buyers who, for 100 small reasons, had stopped coming. The Morris Group employed, at the time of the filing, 134 people, a 91-year-old company, 3 plants, 260 dealers on 3 continents, the first Canadian implement firm into Australia, the inventor of the world's first automatic trip rod weeder, the holder of 15 Canadian patents, a National Historic Event designation from Parks Canada, an exhibit at the Western Development Museum, the Order of Canada on the founder's lapel, and 134 people. Through the spring and into the early summer of 2020, a spring and an early summer in which the entire world was occupied with something other than Saskatchewan farm equipment, the Monitor ran what court documents called a sale and investment solicitation process. Interested parties signed non-disclosure agreements. They looked at the books. They walked through the plants, masked and distanced. On the 26th of May 2020, a non-binding letter of intent arrived. It came from a numbered company that was, behind its corporate veil, an arm of Superior Farm Solutions LP, whose general partner was a Saskatchewan company named Right Way Manufacturing. Right Way had been founded in 1972 by a Regina machine shop owner named Les Hulitzko. Its main plant was at Imperial, Saskatchewan, a village of 300 people on the prairie south of Saskatoon. It made rock pickers, land rollers, heavy harrows, and rotary harrows, tillage equipment that complemented, rather than competed with, the Morris air drill and air cart line. Since 2012, it had been run by a president and chief executive named Heather Forbes. It was owned by a group whose chairman and chief executive, Cameron Johnson, sat in Calgary. It was, in every sense, a Saskatchewan company looking at the wreck of another Saskatchewan company and deciding what it wanted to save. But the letter of intent was not, on its own, a deal. The deal would require the cooperation of the union at Yorkton. Chapter 10. The Vote at the Ball Diamond. The workers at Yorkton belonged to Local 955 of the Retail, Wholesale, and Department Store Union, the RWDSU. The local had been at the plant since the early 1970s. Its history with the company was the long, unglamorous history of any prairie industrial local. Contract by contract, grievance by grievance, layoff by layoff, the union office and the plant office across town from each other, and on speaking terms, even when they were on opposite sides of the table. In August of 2020, the union was asked to vote on a confidential document the Monitor called a Letter of Understanding. The letter, in the carefully chosen language of the court filings, created a fund for terminated workers, a sum of money set aside for the men and women who would lose their jobs in the deal that was being negotiated. The letter would be the foundation on which the sale would rest. The Monitor would later write that, "The importance of the letter of understanding, on which the survival of this business enterprise is based, cannot be overstated." The vote was held outdoors. Indoor union meetings were not happening in the summer of 2020 anywhere in Saskatchewan. Not at the height of the first pandemic year. Not when public health rules limited indoor gatherings to a dozen people and required physical distancing of 6 feet between household groups. So they voted at a baseball diamond on the south side of Yorkton. Lawn chairs. A masked union officer at a folding table behind home plate. Members spread out across the infield grass and the bleachers and the third base line in clusters of 2 and 3, far enough apart that you could not hear what the man 6 meters away was saying. The August prairie sun, the kind that throws hard shadows by mid-afternoon. The diamond's chain-link backstop, a pickup or two parked along the outfield fence, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, the question of whether to approve a document that would help sell the company they had been building, in some cases, for 45 years. They approved it. By the time the formal court approval came, in December, the shape of the deal was clear. Justice Sean Smith of the Court of Queen's Bench granted final approval on the 22nd of December 2020, 3 days before Christmas, in a year in which Saskatchewan Christmases were being celebrated in households of 1 and 2. The buyer was Superior Farm Solutions LP, with Right Way Manufacturing as general partner. The numbered company that completed the purchase would operate as Morris Equipment. What was preserved? The head office in Saskatoon, the Minnedosa plant in Manitoba. All patents and intellectual property going back to the 1929 trip mechanism. The Morris brand. Reasonable prospects, in the Monitor's careful phrase, of re-employment for Saskatoon and Minnedosa staff under the new owner. What was not? The Yorkton plant. The Monitor's report was direct on the point. No party, not Right Way, not any of the other bidders who had come through the sale and investment solicitation process, had expressed to the Monitor an intention to purchase, acquire, or operate the Yorkton plant. The plant that had opened on York Road in June of 1949, that had been expanded every year for the next 18 years, that had put rod weeders and seed rights and magnums and maxims and quantums onto rail cars bound for 3 continents, was not part of the sale. The numbers were small now. 20 workers still active on the floor, building parts. 50 more on layoff. 70 people in total. A total of 70 employees. 20 currently active and 50 laid off at this time, will lose their jobs, Sask Today reported. Juanita Pelagi, the executive director of the Yorkton Chamber of Commerce, spoke to 620 CKRM in Regina the day after the court approval. Morris Industries has been a cornerstone business in Yorkton for over 7 decades, she said. So to lose, that is a blow to the city. The loss of so many high-paying jobs will have an impact on the local economy. Certainly many of these jobs were skilled labor. 7 decades. A cornerstone. A blow. The sale closed on the 31st of December, 2020. The independent Morris Group ceased to exist on New Year's Eve, The Bank of Montreal indicated it would file a bankruptcy order against the remnants of the old corporation in the new year. The monitor would be formally discharged on the 30th of September, 2021. The lights at the Yorkton plant went off. Chapter 11. Canadian Hands. In any other forgotten factory story, this is where the chapter ends. The plant is dark. The workers are scattered. The name on the building comes down, or is painted over, or is left to weather above a parking lot that nobody clears. That is not how this one ends. In Saskatoon, on the morning of the 1st of January 2021, the Morris head office on Airport Drive opened its doors as a subsidiary of Superior Farm Solutions LP. The patents were intact. The Minnedosa plant in Manitoba was, that morning, beginning its first day under new ownership, but in essential continuity. The same lines, the same fixtures, the same paint booth, the same red, and the same black. The dealer agreements were being renegotiated rather than torn up. The engineering staff in Saskatoon was being kept on. Heather Forbes, who had run Right Way since 2012, was running Morris as well. The Monitor's report, in one of its less noticed sentences, had said this: "The deal will preserve the core components of the 90-year-old farm equipment manufacturing enterprise carried on by Morris Group and its predecessors continuously from the 1920s until the present date." In May of 2024, Right Way and Morris were brought together under a unified parent company, Superior Farms Equipment Ltd. SFE. The product lines were redesignated Right Way SFE, Morris SFE, and Pro AG SFE. Cameron Johnson, the chairman and chief executive, put his name to a release that announced the unification. "We are thrilled to unveil Superior Farms Equipment and unify the companies to better serve our customers," he said. The combined companies will continue to be operated by Heather Forbes, who will become the president of SFE after having successfully led Right Way as its president and CEO since 2012. What followed in the next 2 years would settle the question of whether the rescue had been an act of preservation or an act of asset stripping. In late 2024 and into 2025, SFE began rolling out the Morris 10 Series air cart. 5 models, 4 scaled tanks, a completely redesigned electric metering system. The first new Morris product since the Quantum, built by the same engineers, in the same plant in Manitoba, under the same red and black colors. And in July of 2026, at the Ag in Motion show outside Langham, Saskatchewan, the same show at which Ben Voss had unveiled the Quantum 8 years earlier, Superior Farms Equipment launched the Morris Quantum 100-foot air drill, paired with a 1,440-bushel Morris 10 Series air cart, aimed, in the words of SFE's Director of Sales Garth Massey, at crop producers working around 9,000 acres. The largest Morris machine ever built. Full release was set for 2027. The drill that had killed the company under one ownership had been redesigned, rebuilt, and relaunched under another, at a scale George Morris would not have imagined was possible, on the day, in 1930, that he rode a horse over to a neighbor's farm to sell a hand-built 8-foot weeder for $148. Chapter 12. What remains? The Yorkton plant on York Road is closed. Nobody bought it. Nobody operates it. 70 people, 20 active and 50 on layoff at the time of the closure, lost their jobs. Some of them had been on that floor for 45 years. The men with 45 years of service are in their late 60s now. They did not need to find another welding job. The men with 25 years of service did. The men with 35 years of service had to decide whether to take early retirement or to move. A Yorkton welder in his late 50s, with 3.5 decades of Morris floor experience, is a tradesman of an unusual kind. He can read a fabrication drawing the way a musician reads a score. He has welded frame uprights in -40 winters and through Western Canadian summers, when the bay was 110 degrees inside. He has the union card, and the safety record, and the references. Where he does not have a job is in Yorkton itself, because Yorkton itself does not have, in 2021, or 2022, or 2023, another Morris-scale heavy iron manufacturer hiring 50 welders at once. Some went west, to Saskatoon, to Calgary, to Edmonton, to the oil patch. Some went to Bourgault at Saint-Brieuc, where the rivals' continued growth absorbed some of the prairie industrial workforce Morris could no longer hold. Some retired. Some took whatever work they could find in Yorkton itself, which meant maintenance, or trucking, or, for a few, the bitter irony of a job at the Morris Parts and Service operation that had been folded into the new SFE structure, working on the iron they had once built. The factory itself is still there. Sash by sash, the windows have begun to fail in the way Saskatchewan factory windows fail, by freezing in their frames and cracking when the building cools and contracts in February nights at -35. The corrugated roof is still on. The Morris name is still readable on the side, though it has faded a half shade in the prairie sun every summer since the lights went off. No condominium developer has come for the land. There is no condominium market in Yorkton. The site sits the way prairie industrial sites sit when they are no longer needed, quiet, intact, waiting for a use that may or may not come. Around the perimeter, the grass has come up through the cracks in the asphalt. Aspens have begun to seed themselves in the strip between the parking lot and the rail spur, the way aspens do on the prairies whenever something stops being maintained for 2 years running. A muskrat has dug a hole somewhere under the loading dock. A pair of red-tailed hawks nests on a light pole at the southeast corner of the property, and has done so since the second summer after the closure. They have raised, by now, several broods of young in the absence of any noise loud enough to bother them. Down the road from the plant, the Western Development Museum still has the original Battersby rod weeder on display. Artifact WDM 1973 Y2834, hand-built in a garage at Bangor in 1930. Used by a farmer at Goodeve for 21 years, bought back by George Morris in 1951, donated by him to the museum, and standing now in a quiet hall on the south side of Yorkton, behind a small placard that tells visitors what it is and what it did. The story it does not tell is the longer one, that the company built around it survived the Dust Bowl, that it survived the Depression and the Second World War, that it survived the consolidation of the American Big Three through the 1980s and the 1990s, that it survived the end of the crow rate, the end of the single-desk wheat board, the rise of Bourgault, the steel and aluminum tariffs of 2018, and the canola ban of 2019, that it almost did not survive its own ambition, that the quantum drill, the strongest drill the company ever built, very nearly broke the company that built it, that the lights at Yorkton did go off, and the 70 people did lose their jobs, and the family company that George Morris started in 1929 did die at the end of 2020, and that the brand did not. In Saskatoon, on a January morning, the Morris head office on Airport Drive is open. The engineers are at their desks. In Manitoba, at Minnedosa, the line is running. The fixtures are loaded. The welders are striking arcs against frame uprights for a 100-foot quantum that will go onto a flat car in 2027 and out to a farm in southern Alberta, or northern Texas, or western Australia. The red is still red. The black is still black. The patents are intact, including, somewhere in a binder in a fireproof cabinet, the original 1929 trip mechanism, a spring that lets a steel rod lift over a stone and plunge back into the dirt without breaking. A spring, in other words, that lets the thing survive. The first rod weeder sold for $148 in the spring of 1930 to a farmer at Goodeve who used it for 21 years. The latest Morris drill will sell for several $100,000 and will go onto farms of 9,000 acres. Between the two of them lies a man on a horse, a dust bowl, a war, a daughter who carried the company for 16 years, 2 ownership changes, a quantum that broke under hydraulic pressures that no one had thought to test, a baseball diamond outside Yorkton on an August afternoon, a courtroom in Saskatoon 3 days before Christmas, and a neighbor from across the province who looked at the wreck and decided that the name on the side of the building was worth saving. The Yorkton plant is dark. The Yorkton workers are gone. The independent family company George Morris, founded in a garage at Bangor in 1929, is dead. The iron is still being built. Not the ending the audience expected. Not a triumph. Not quite a tragedy either. The independent company is gone, and that loss is real. And the 70 Yorkton workers are real. And the building on York Road is real and empty, and slowly being reclaimed by the prairie itself. But the spring in the steel held one more time. A Saskatchewan brand was saved by Saskatchewan hands. And on a prairie morning in 2027, when the first 100-foot quantum rolls out of Minnedosa onto a flat car bound for a farm that George Morris could not have imagined, the name on the side of the drill will still be the name of a boy who rode a horse out of Bangor in 1930 to sell the machine that ended the horse economy. The spring in the steel did what it was designed to do. It yielded. It lifted. It plunged back down. It kept going.